Section 55 of All About Coffee. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. All About Coffee by William Ukers. The History of Coffee and Literature, Part 4. Modern journalism dates from the publication, April 12, 1709, of The Tatler, whose editor was Sir Richard Steele, 1672 to 1729, the Irish dramatist and essayist. He received his inspiration from the coffee houses, and his readers were the men that knew them best. In the first issue he announced, "All accounts of gallantry, pleasure, and entertainment shall be under the article of White's Coffee House, poetry under that of Will's Coffee House, learning under the title of Grecian. Foreign and domestic news you will have from St. James's Coffee House, and what else I shall on any other subject offer shall be dated from my own apartment." Steele's Tatler was issued 3 times weekly until 1711, when it suspended to be succeeded by The Spectator, whose principal contributor was Joseph Addison, 1672 to 1719, the essayist and poet, and Steele's schoolfellow. Sir Richard Steele immortalized the Don and Don Saltero's coffee house in Old Chelsea in number 34 of the Tatler, wherein he tells us of the necessity of traveling to know the world, by his journey for fresh air no farther than the village of Chelsea, of which he fancied that he could give an immediate description, from the 5 fields where the robbers lie in wait to the coffee house where the literary sit in council. But he found, even in a place so near town as this, that there were enormities and persons of eminence whom he before knew nothing of. The coffee house was almost absorbed by the museum. Steele says, "When I came into the coffee house, I had not time to salute the company before my eyes were diverted by 10,000 gimcracks round the room, and on the ceiling. When my first astonishment was over, comes to me a sage of thin and meagre countenance, which aspect made me doubt whether reading or fretting had made it so philosophic. But I very soon perceived him to be that sort which the ancients called gingivisti, in our language tooth drawers." I immediately had a respect for the man, for these practical philosophers go upon a very practical hypothesis, not to cure, but to take away the part affected. My love of mankind made me very benevolent to Mr. Salter, for such is the name of this eminent barber and antiquary. The Don was famous for his punch and for his skill on the fiddle. He drew teeth also, and wrote verses. He described his museum in several stanzas, one of which is, "Monsters of all sorts are seen, strange things in nature as they grew so, some relics of the Sheba Queen, and fragments of the famed Bob Crusoe." Steele then plunges into a deep thought why barbers should go farther in hitting the ridiculous than any other set of men, and maintains that Don Saltero is descended in a right line, not from John Transcendent as he himself asserts, but from the memorable companion of the Knight of Mancha. Steele certifies to all the worthy citizens who travel to see the Don's rarities, that his double-barreled pistols, targets, coats of mail, his sclopeta, hand culverin, and sword of Toledo, were left to his ancestor by the said Don Quixote, and by his ancestor to all his progeny down to Saltero. Though Steele thus goes far in favor of Don Soltero's great merit, he objects to his imposing several names, without his license, on the collection he has made, to the abuse of the good people of England, one of which is particularly calculated to deceive religious persons, to the great scandal of the well disposed, and may introduce heterodox opinions. Among the curiosities presented by Admiral Munden was a coffin containing the body or relics of a Spanish saint who had wrought miracles. Says Steele, "He shows you a straw hat, which I know to be made by Madge Pescad within 3 miles of Bedford, and tells you it is Pontius Pilate's wife's chambermaid's sister's hat." To my knowledge of this very hat, it may be added that the covering of straw was never used among the Jews, since it was demanded of them to make bricks without it. Therefore this is nothing but, under the specious pretense of learning and antiquities, to impose upon the world. There are other things which I cannot tolerate among his rarities, as the china figure of the lady in the glass case, the Italian engine for the imprisonment of those who go abroad with it, both of which I hereby order to be taken down, or else he may expect to have his letters patent for making punch superseded, be debarred wearing his muff next winter, or ever coming to London without his wife. Babelard says that Salter had an old gray muff, and that by wearing it up to his nose he was distinguishable at the distance of 1/4 of a mile. His wife was none of the best, being much addicted to scolding; and Salter, who liked his glass, if he could make a trip to London by himself, was in no haste to return. Don Soltero's proved very attractive as an exhibition, and drew crowds to the coffee house. A catalogue was published of which were printed more than 40 editions. Smollett, the novelist, was among the donors. The catalogue in 1760 comprehended the following rarities: tiger's tusks, the Pope's candle, the skeleton of a guinea pig, a fly-cap monkey, a piece of the true cross, the 4 evangelists' heads cut out on a cherry stone, the King of Morocco's tobacco pipe, Mary Queen of Scots' pincushion, Queen Elizabeth's prayer book, a pair of nuns' stockings, Job's ears which grew on a tree, a frog in a tobacco stopper, and 500 more odd relics. The Don had a rival, as appears by a catalogue of the rarities to be seen at Adams' at the Royal Swan in Kingsland Road leading from Shoreditch Church, 1756. Mr. Adams exhibited for the entertainment of the curious Miss Jenny Cameron's shoes, Adams' eldest daughter's hat, the heart of the famous Bess Adams, that was hanged at Tyburn with Lawyer Carr, January 18th, 1736–37, Sir Walter Raleigh's tobacco pipe, Vicar of Bray's clogs, engine to shell green peas with, teeth that grew in a fish's belly, Black Jack's ribs, the very comb that Abraham combed his son Isaac and Jacob's head with, Wat Tyler's spurs, rope that cured Captain Lowry of the headache, earache, toothache, and bellyache, Adam's key of the fore and back door of the Garden of Eden, etc., etc. These are only a few out of 500 other equally marvelous exhibits. The success of Don Soltero in attracting visitors to his coffee house induced the proprietor of the Chelsea Bun House to make a similar collection of rarities, to attract customers for his buns, and to some extent it was successful. In the first number of the Spectator, Addison says, There is no place of general resort wherein I do not often make my appearance. Sometimes I am seen thrusting my head into a round of politicians at Will's, and listening with great attention to the narratives that are made in those little circular audiences. Sometimes I smoke a pipe at Child's, and while I seem attentive to nothing but the postman, overhear the conversation of every table in the room. I appear on Sunday nights at St. James's Coffee House, and sometimes join the little committee of politics in the inner room as one who comes there to hear and improve. My face is likewise very well known at the Grecian, the Cocoa Tree, and in the theatres both of Drury Lane and the Haymarket. I have been taken for a merchant upon the Exchange for above these 10 years, and sometimes pass for a Jew in the assembly of stock jobbers at Jonathan's. In short, wherever I see a cluster of people, I always mix with them, though I never open my lips but in my own club. In the second number he tells that I am now settled with a widow woman who has a great many children and complies with my humor in everything. I do not remember that we have exchanged a word together for these 5 years. My coffee comes into my chamber every morning without asking for it. If I want fire, I point to the chimney; if water, to my basin, upon which my landlady nods as much as to say, she takes my meaning, and immediately obeys my signals. 3 of Addison's papers in the Spectator, numbers 402, 481, and 568, are humorously descriptive of the coffee houses of the period. Number 403 opens with the remark that the courts of 2 countries do not so much differ from one another as the court and the city in their peculiar ways of life and conversation. In short, the inhabitants of St. James, notwithstanding they live under the same laws and speak the same language, are a distinct people from those of Cheapside, who are likewise removed from those of the Temple on the one side and those of Smithfield on the other, by several climates and degrees in their way of thinking and conversing together. For this reason, the author takes a ramble through London and Westminster to gather the opinions of his ingenious countrymen upon a current report of the King of France's death. I know the faces of all the principal politicians within the bills of mortality, and as every coffee house has some particular statesman belonging to it, who is the mouth of the street where he lives, I always take care to place myself near him, in order to know his judgment on the present posture of affairs. And as I foresaw the above report would produce a new face of things in Europe, and many curious speculations in our British coffee houses, I was very desirous to learn the thoughts of our most eminent politicians on that occasion. That I might begin as near the fountainhead as possible, I first of all called in at St. James's, where I found the whole outward room in a buzz of politics. The speculations were but very indifferent towards the door, but grew finer as you advanced to the upper end of the room, and were so much improved by a knot of theorists who sat in the inner room within the steams of the coffee pot, that I there heard the whole Spanish monarchy disposed of, and all the line of Bourbons provided for, in less than a quarter of an hour. I afterwards called in at Giles's, where I saw a board of French gentlemen sitting upon the life and death of their grand monarch. Those among them who had espoused the Whig interest very positively affirmed that he had departed this life about a week since, and therefore proceeded without any further delay to the release of their friends in the galleys, and to their own reestablishment. But finding they could not agree among themselves, I proceeded on my intended progress. Upon my arrival at Jenny Mann's, I saw an alert young fellow that cocked his hat upon a friend of his, who entered just at the same time with myself, and accosted him after the following manner: "Well, Jack, the old prig is dead at last. Sharp's the word. Now or never, boy. Up to the walls of Paris directly," with several other deep reflections of the same nature. I met with very little variation in the politics between Charing Cross and Covent Garden, and upon my going into Will's I found their discourse was gone off, from the death of the French king to that of Monsieur Boileau, Racine, Corneille, and several other poets, whom they regretted on this occasion as persons who would have obliged the world with very noble elegies on the death of so great a prince, and so eminent a patron of learning. At a coffee house near the Temple I found a couple of young gentlemen engaged very smartly in a dispute on the succession to the Spanish monarchy. One of them seemed to have been retained as advocate for the Duke of Anjou, the other for his Imperial Majesty. They were both for regarding the title to that kingdom by the statute laws of England. But finding them going out of my depth, I pressed forward to Paul's Churchyard, where I listened with great attention to a learned man, who gave the company an account of the deplorable state of France during the minority of the deceased king. I then turned on my right hand into Fish Street, where the chief politician of that quarter, upon hearing the news, after having taken a pipe of tobacco and ruminated for some time, "If," says he, "the King of France is certainly dead, we shall have plenty of mackerel this season. Our fishery will not be disturbed by privateers, as it has been for these 10 years past." He afterwards considered how the death of this great man would affect our pilchards, and by several other remarks infused a general joy into his whole audience. I afterwards entered a by coffee house that stood at the upper end of a narrow lane, where I met with a nonjuror, engaged very warmly with a laceman who was the great support of a neighboring conventicle. The matter in debate was whether the late French king was most like Augustus Caesar or Nero. The controversy was carried on with great heat on both sides, and as each of them looked upon me very frequently during the course of their debate, I was under some apprehension that they would appeal to me, and therefore laid down my penny at the bar, and made the best of my way to Cheapside. I here gazed upon the signs for some time before I found one to my purpose. The first object I met in the coffee room was a person who expressed a great grief for the death of the French king, but upon his explaining himself, I found his sorrow did not arise from the loss of the monarch, but for his having sold out of the bank about 3 days before he heard the news of it. Upon which a haberdasher, who was the oracle of the coffee house, and had his circle of admirers about him, called several to witness that he had declared his opinion above a week before, that the French king was certainly dead. To which he added, that considering the late advices we had received from France, it was impossible that it could be otherwise. As he was laying these together, and debating to his hearers with great authority, there came a gentleman from Garraway's, who told us that there were several letters from France just come in, with advice that the king was in good health, and was gone out a-hunting the very morning the post came away. Upon which the haberdasher stole off his hat that hung upon a wooden peg by him, and retired to his shop with great confusion. This intelligence put a stop to my travels, which I had prosecuted with so much satisfaction, not being a little pleased to hear so many different opinions upon so great an event, and to observe how naturally, upon such a piece of news, every one is apt to consider it to his particular interest and advantage. Johnson wrote in his Life of Addison concerning the Tatler and the Spectator that they were published at a time when two parties, loud, restless, and violent, each with plausible declarations, and both perhaps without any distinct determination of its views, were agitating the nation. To minds heated with political contest they supplied cooler and more inoffensive reflections. They had a perceptible influence on the conversation of the time, and taught the frolic and the gay to unite merriment with decency, effects which they can never wholly lose. Harold Ruth, in the Cambridge History of Literature, speaking of the Spectator, says, "It surpassed the Tatler in style and in thought. It gave expression to the power of commerce. For more than a century, traders had been characterized as dishonest and avaricious, because playwrights and pamphleteers generally wrote for the leisure classes, and were themselves too poor to have any but unpleasant relations with men of business. Now merchants were becoming ambassadors of civilization, and had developed intellect so as to control distant and, as it seemed, mysterious sources of wealth. By a stroke of the pen, and largely through the coffee houses, they had come to know their own importance and power." Samuel Pepys (1633 1703) was very fond of good eating, and almost daily entries were made in his diary of dinner delicacies that he had enjoyed. One dinner that he considered a great success was served to 8 persons, and consisted of oysters, a hash of rabbits, a lamb, a rare sheen of beef. Next, a great dish of roasting fowl, cost me about 30 shillings, a tart, then fruit and cheese. My dinner was noble enough. I believe this day's feast will cost me near £5. But it will be noted that coffee was not mentioned as a part of the menu. He makes countless references to visits paid to this and that coffee house, but records only one instance of actually drinking coffee. "Up betimes to my office, and thence at 7 o'clock to Sir G. Carteret, and there with Sir J. Minns made an end of his accounts, but stayed not to dinner, my lady having made us drink our morning draught there of several wines. But I drank nothing but some of her coffee, which was poorly made, with a little sugar in it." This note, which he considered worthy of record, was certainly not inspired by the excellence of the good lady's matutinal coffee. William Cobbett (1762 1835), the English-American politician, reformer, and writer on economics, denounced coffee as slops, but he was one of a remarkably small minority. Before his day, one of England's great satirists, Dean Swift (1667 1745), led a long roll of literary men who were devotees of coffee. Swift's writings are full of references to coffee, and his letters from Stella came to him under cover at the St. James Coffee House. There is scarcely a letter to Esther (Vanessa) von Hamrich which does not contain a significant reference to coffee, by which the course of their friendship and clandestine meetings may be traced. In one dated August 13th, 1720, written while traveling from place to place in Ireland, he says, "We live here in a very dull town, every valuable creature absent, and Cad says he is weary of it." and would rather prefer his coffee on the barrenest mountain in Wales than be king here. A fig for partridges and quails, ye dainties, I know nothing of ye, but on the highest mount in Wales would choose in peace to drink my coffee. In another letter, about 2 years later, replying to one in which Vanessa has reproached him, and begged him to write her soon, he advises, "The best maxim I know in life is to drink your coffee when you can, and when you cannot, to be easy without it. While you continue to be splenetic, count upon it I will always preach. Thus much I sympathize with you, for I am not cheerful enough to write. For, I believe, coffee once a week is necessary, and you know very well that coffee makes us severe and grave and philosophical." These various references to coffee are thought to have been based upon an incident in the early days of their friendship, when, on the occasion of the Van Homrigh family journeying from Dublin to London, Vanessa accidentally spilt her coffee in the chimney place at a certain inn, which Swift considered a premonition of their growing friendship. Writing from Clogher, Swift reminds Vanessa, "Remember that riches are 9 parts in 10 of all that is good in life, and health is the 10th. Drinking coffee comes long after, and yet it is the 11th, but without the 2 former you cannot drink it right." In another letter he writes facetiously, in memory of her playful badinage, "I long to drink a dish of coffee in the sluttery, and here you dun me for a secret, and drink your coffee, why don't you drink your coffee?" Leigh Hunt had very pleasant things to say about coffee, giving to it the charm of appeal to the imagination, which he said one never finds in tea. For example, "Coffee, like tea, used to form a refreshment by itself, some hours after dinner. It is now taken as a digester, right upon that meal or the wine, and sometimes does not even close it. Or the digester itself is digested by a liquor of some sort called a chasse café, coffee chaser. We like coffee better than tea for taste, but tea for a constancy. To be perfect in point of relish, we do not say of wholesomeness, coffee should be strong and hot, with little milk and sugar. It has been drunk after this mode in some parts of Europe, but the public have nowhere, we believe, adopted it. The favorite way of taking it at a meal abroad is with a great superfluity of milk, very properly called in France café au lait, coffee to the milk. One of the pleasures we receive in drinking coffee is that, being the universal drink in the East, it reminds of that region of the Arabian Nights, as smoking does for the same reason, though neither of these refreshments, which are identified with Oriental manners, is to be found in that enchanting work. They had not been discovered when it was written. The drink then was sherbet. One can hardly fancy what a Turk or a Persian could have done without coffee and a pipe, any more than the English ladies and gentlemen before the civil wars without tea for breakfast. In his old age, Immanuel Kant, the great metaphysician, became extremely fond of coffee, and Thomas de Quincey relates a little incident showing Kant's great eagerness for the after-dinner cup. At the beginning of the last year of his life, he fell into a custom of taking, immediately after dinner, a cup of coffee, especially on those days when it happened that I was of his party. And such was the importance that he attached to his little pleasure, that he would even make a memorandum beforehand, in the blank paper book that I had given him, that on the next day I was to dine with him, and consequently that there was to be coffee. Sometimes, in the interest of conversation, the coffee was forgotten, but not for long. He would remember, and with the querulousness of old age and infirm health, would demand that coffee be brought upon the spot. Arrangements had always been made in advance, however. The coffee was ground and the water was boiling, and in the very moment the word was given, the servant shot in like an arrow and plunged the coffee into the water. All that remained, therefore, was to give it time to boil up. But this trifling delay seemed unendurable to Kant. If it were said, "Dear Professor, the coffee will be brought up in a moment," he would say, "Will be! There's the rub, that it only will be." Then he would quiet himself with a stoical air and say, "Well, one can die after all. It is but dying. And in the next world, thank God, there is no drinking of coffee, and consequently no waiting for it." When at length the servant's steps were heard upon the stairs, he would turn round to us and joyfully call out, "Land, land, my dear friends, I see land." Thackeray, 1811 to 1863, must have suffered many tea and coffee disappointments. In the Kickleberries on the Rhine, he asks, "Why do they always put mud into coffee aboard steamers? Why does the tea generally taste of boiled boots?" In authors, A. Neil Lyons has preserved for all time the atmosphere of the London coffee stall. "I would not," he says, "exchange a night at Author's for a week with the brainiest circle in London." The book is a collection of short stories. As already recorded, Harold Chapin dramatized this picturesque London institution in The Autocrat of the Coffee Stall. In General Horace Porter's Campaigning with Grant, we have 3 distinct coffee incidents within 50-odd pages, or explicitly see pages 47, 56, 101. Where, deep in the fiercest snarls of the Wilderness Campaign, we are treated to General Grant, slowly sipping his coffee, a full ration of that soothing army beverage. The general made rather a singular meal, preparatory to so exhausting a day as that which was to follow. He took a cucumber, sliced it, poured some vinegar over it, and partook of nothing else except a cup of strong coffee. The general seemed in excellent spirits, and was even inclined to be jocose. He said to me, "We have just had our coffee, and you will find some left for you." I drank it with the relish of a shipwrecked mariner. One of the first immediate supplies General Sherman desired from Wilmington on reaching Fayetteville and lines of communication in March 1865 was expressly coffee. Does he not say so himself on page 297 of the 2nd volume of his Memoirs? Still more expressly, towards the close of his Memoirs, and among final recommendations, the fruit of his experiences in that whole vast war, General Sherman says this for coffee: "Coffee has become almost indispensable, though many substitutes were found for it, such as Indian corn, roasted, ground, and boiled as coffee; the sweet potato, and the seed of the okra plant, prepared in the same way. All these were used by the people of the South, who for years could procure no coffee. But I noticed that the women always begged of us real coffee, which seemed to satisfy a natural yearning or craving more powerful than can be accounted for on the theory of habit. Therefore, I would always advise that the coffee and sugar ration be carried along, even at the expense of bread, for which there are many substitutes." George Agnew Chamberlain's novel Home contains a vivid description of coffee making on an old plantation, and could only have been written by a devoted lover of this drink. Jerry Lansing, the American, has escaped drowning in the river, and is now lost in the Brazilian forest. He finds his way at last to an old plantation house. A stove was built into the masonry, and a cavernous oven gaped from the massive wall. At the stove was an old negress making coffee with shaky deliberation. The girl and the wrinkled old woman made him sit down at the table, and then placed before him crisp rusks of mandioc flour and steaming coffee, whose splendid aroma triumphed over the sordidness of the scene, and through the nostrils reached the palate with anticipatory touch. It was sweetened with dark, pungent syrup, and was served black in a capacious bowl, as though one could not drink too deeply of the elixir of life. Jerry ate ravenously, and sipped the coffee, at first sparingly, then greedily. Jerry set down the empty bowl with a sigh. The rusks had been delicious. Before the coffee the name of nectar dwindled to impotency. Its elixir rioted in his veins. In The Rosary, Florence L. Barclay has a Scotch woman tell how she makes coffee. She says, "Use a jug. It is not what you make it in, it is how ye make it. It all hangs upon the word fresh. Freshly roasted, freshly ground, water freshly boiled. And never touch it with metal. Pop it into an earthenware jug, pour in your boiling water straight upon it, stir it with a wooden spoon, set it on the hob 10 minutes to settle. The grounds will all go to the bottom, though you might not think it, and you pour it out, fragrant, strong, and clear. But the secret is fresh, 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 and don't stint your coffee." Cyrus Townsend Brady's The Corner in Coffee is a thrilling romance of the New York coffee market. Coffee, Du Barry, and Louis XV figure in one scene of the story of The Moat with the Crimson Stains, as told by Elizabeth W. Champney in her Romance of the Bourbon Chateau. It tells of the German apprentice Reisner, who assisted his master Oben in designing for Louis XV a beautiful desk with a secret drawer, which it took 10 years of unremitting industry to execute. At the end, Reisner was to be accepted by his master as a partner and a son-in-law. Little Victoire, who loved to sit in a punt and trail her doll in the waters of the Bève, to see to what color its frock would be changed by the dyes of the Gobelin factory, was then only 5, and Madame Aubin 23. As the years rolled by, Reisner grew to love the mother and not the daughter, who meanwhile shot up into a slim girl, not of her mother's beauty, but of a loveliness all her own. Then there was a quarrel, because the young apprentice thought the master should have resented the suggestion of Monsieur Duplessis that his wife pose in the nude for the statuettes, which were to hold the sconces on the king's desk, and Reisner left in a fine youthful frenzy, vowing he would never return while the maître lived. The latter, unable to complete the masterpiece which he loved more than anything else on earth, sought death, and perished in the crimson waters of the Bève. The maître had no enemies, but his quarrel with Reisner caused a fear to spring up in the widow's heart that the apprentice might have been guilty of his murder. So she refused to see him when, hearing of his master's death, he returned, stricken with remorse, to finish the desk. On it were the statuettes modeled in perfect likeness of Mademoiselle de Vaubernier, a wily little milliner of Reisner's Bohemian set, who had taken this way to bring herself to the attention of Louis XV. The ruse was successful, and after the acceptance of the desk there was installed a new maîtresse en titre, the notorious Madame du Barry, erstwhile the pretty milliner, Mademoiselle de Vaubernier. Later, Madame du Barry sent for the now famous ébéniste, cabinet maker, and when her negro page Zamore admitted him, he found His Majesty Louis XV kneeling in front of the fireplace, making coffee for her while she laughed at him for scalding his fingers. He had been summoned to show the king the mechanism of the secret drawer, so cunningly concealed in the king's desk that no one could find it. But Reisner knew not the secret of his master, who had died without revealing it. Then the Red Revolution came, and when the pretty pavilion at Louveciennes was sacked, and its costly furniture hurled down the cliff to the Seine, the king's desk, shattered almost beyond repair, was carried to the Gobelin factory and presented to Madame Aubin in recognition of her husband's workmanship. Then the secret compartment was found to have been disclosed, and Reisner was absolved by a letter therein from the Maître, who intimated he was about to end it all because of paralysis. Reisner marries the widow, and all ends happily. James Lane Allen, in The Kentucky Warbler, tells a tale of the bluegrass country, and of a young hero who wanders after a bird's note to find romance and the key to his own locked nature. Here is an incident from his first forest adventure. There was one tree he curiously looked around for, positive that he should not be blind to it if fortunate enough to set his eyes on one, the coffee tree. That is, he felt sure he'd recognize it if it yielded coffee ready to drink, of which never in his life had they given him enough. Not once throughout his long troubled experience as to being fed had he been allowed as much coffee as he craved. Once, when younger, he had heard someone say that the only tree in all of American forests that bore the name of Kentucky was the Kentucky coffee tree, and he had instantly conceived a desire to pay a visit in secret to that corner of the woods, to take his cup and a few lumps of sugar and sit under the boughs and catch the coffee as it dripped down. No one to hold him back. As much as he wanted at last. The Kentucky coffee tree, his favorite in nature. John Kendrick Bangs relates, in Coffee and Repartee, some amusing skirmishes indulged in at the boarding-house table between the idiot and the guests, where coffee served the purpose of enlivening the tilt. "Can't I give you another cup of coffee?" asked the landlady of the schoolmaster. "You may," returned the schoolmaster, pained at the lady's grammar, but too courteous to call attention to it save by the emphasis with which he spoke the word may. Said the idiot, "You may fill my cup too, Mrs. Smithers." "The coffee is all gone," returned the landlady with a snap. "Then, Mary," said the idiot, gracefully turning to the maid, "you may give me a glass of ice water. It is quite as warm after all as the coffee, and not quite so weak." One other little skit remains at the expense of Mrs. Smithers' coffee. At the breakfast table, where the air as usual is charged with repartee, Mr. Whitechoker, the minister, says to his landlady, "Mrs. Smithers, I'll have a dash of hot water in my coffee this morning." Then, with a glance toward the idiot, he added, "I think it looks like rain." "Referring to the coffee, Mr. Whitechoker?" queried the idiot. "Ah, I don't quite follow you," replied the minister with some annoyance. "You said something looked like rain, and I asked you if the thing referred to was the coffee, for I was disposed to agree with you," said the idiot. "I am sure," put in Mrs. Smithers, "that a gentleman of Mr. Whitechoker's refinement would not make any such insinuation, sir. He is not the man to quarrel with what is set before him." "I must ask your pardon, madam," returned the idiot politely. "I hope I am not the man to quarrel with my food either. Indeed, I make it a rule to avoid unpleasantness of all sorts, particularly with the weak, under which category I find your coffee." End of section 55.